The secret war that broke the CIA. The night the CIA realized the mole was inside, 100 words. The phones started ringing before dawn. Secure lines lit up, one after another, as Moscow Station reported silence where voices should be. A handler stood in a shadowed alley, waiting on a dead drop that never got picked up. Another asset missed a brush pass, then another. Within hours, names that fed Washington for years were either quiet or gone. The station's surveillance teams felt eyes on them they couldn't shake. In Langley, analysts stared at blank cables, sensing something worse than bad luck. Someone had turned off the lights from inside. To understand how, we have to rewind. The uneasy calm before the storm. Late 1970s, intelligence picture. Go back to the late 1970s. Inside Langley, the agency looked steady on the outside and shaken on the inside. The Church Committee had aired secrets that were never supposed to leave the vault. Covert actions, domestic operations that crossed lines, and a culture that prided itself on improvisation more than rules. The response landed like concrete. Oversight hardened. Attorneys sat closer to operators. Compliance binders grew heavier. Morale, especially in the Directorate of Operations, took a hit. Counterintelligence, the paranoid cousin nobody liked to invite to meetings, drifted to the edge of the table. Here's where the shift mattered. The tech wave was rising. Satellites were delivering images so sharp they felt like cheating. SIGINT could pick up missile tests, air defense networks, the hard machinery of an empire. Decision-makers loved clean pictures and clean intercepts. Moscow, the target that had humbled spies since the 1940s, started to look manageable from space. A dennied area, yes, but dennied areas could be photographed. You didn't need to risk a meet on a snowy street if a KH-11 could watch the courtyard. Except people still make history, and HUMINT still finds what machines can't. In the late 1970s, case officers who'd done the grim work of running assets in hostile capitals warned that Moscow streets weren't getting easier. The KGB under Yuri Andropov had spent years building a doctrine that treated foreign intelligence as an invasive species to be hunted relentlessly. Surveillance teams trained to blend, to pass off, to ride targets for days with patience Americans routinely underestimated. Active measures didn't just mean propaganda. It meant manipulating the adversary's mind, seeding doubt, staging incidents to push operations off balance. Inside Langley, the old Angleton ghost still haunted conversations. James Angleton's mole hunts had spiraled into paralysis earlier in the decade, wrecking careers and freezing operations. The lesson many took was simple. Don't let counterintelligence run the show. So when CI officers raised their hands in the late 70s and said, "We're missing patterns," they got nods, and then the meeting moved on. The culture rewarded the hunter who brought home a new source, not the skeptic who said the source might be false or the meat might be watched. Early cracks appeared as tightening, a surveillance team that seemed stickier than usual, a safe house that felt discovered but never raided, an asset who asked to delay a meet because he sensed pressure, then drifted. Case officers wrote it up as Moscow Rules 101. Assume you're watched, adapt, try again. Headquarters read the traffic and saw friction, not failure. The agency could afford patience because satellites kept the intel pipeline flowing. If HUMINT had a bad week, imagery had a good one. It balanced out, at least on paper. Meanwhile, the KGB's counterintelligence cadres weren't just aggressive, they were methodical. Andropov's emphasis on ideological vigilance pushed officers to treat every Western approach as part of a larger design. They practiced full-time surveillance at a scale the CIA struggled to mirror. Two-man teams fed into rolling units, layered with static observation posts, seeded with doormen, street sweepers, even schoolchildren who recognized faces and cars. Western tradecraft that played well in other capitals got exposed in Moscow because the baseline was different. Nothing was casual there. Langley's own internal politics made that worse. Operators and analysts lived in a productive rivalry that too often turned defensive. Analysts wanted verifiable streams they could brief with confidence. Operators wanted freedom to recruit and run the sources that made analysis insightful. Counterintelligence sounded like brake pads screeching in both worlds. CI would question a source's access, warn about deception, ask for tighter compartmentation, and cut across the grain of the need it yesterday tempo. Get this, there were warnings in small, human moments that never made PowerPoints. A case officer returned from a tour, convinced that a routine SDR route had been mirrored by surveillance, yet the meat still went down because the source was due to travel. Nothing happened, so it looked fine. Another officer's expense reports flagged unusual cash fluctuations, but a supervisor waved it off as family issues and stress. A young CI analyst wrote an internal note. Moscow's watchers were beating their own patterns. She didn't get a reply for weeks. By 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan recentered the mission on hard targets and big questions. The White House demanded clarity on intent, capability, and timelines. The agency leaned into the tools that could answer fast. Imagery of columns moving, intercepts of command nets lighting up, logistic nodes ramping. HUMINT still mattered, especially sources inside the Soviet military and the party, but recruiting in Moscow remained a fantasy most days. The few assets reporting from inside the Soviet system were handled with extreme caution, so much caution that any anomaly could be blamed on caution itself. Then came a subtle but corrosive shift. Success metrics turned bureaucratic. Checklists, compliance signatures, passing polygraphs, clean audit trails, these became shorthand for secure. Counterintelligence became a box to check rather than a discipline to breathe. A passed polygraph meant you're good. A completed financial disclosure meant you're clean. A TDY report signed by 3 offices meant the risk was managed. It looked like rigor. It felt like order. It wasn't curiosity. Meanwhile, the KGB studied the CIA's habits and built mirrors. They ran dangles to test appetites. They staged tales to test confidence. They forced Western officers into patterns that looked self-selected but were engineered. A late train, a repair crew on a familiar street, a casual bump at a hotel bar by someone with just enough English and just enough ignorance to seem harmless. It wasn't about catching every mouse. It was about making the cheese cage feel safe. Inside the building, the generation that came up after church believed they were steering the agency into adulthood. They prized legality, polished briefings, and a measured posture. The old-timers grumbled that the edge was gone. The younger cohort countered that reckless edges get people killed and agencies gutted. Both were a little right. But in the gap between them, counterintelligence lost ground not in doctrine, but in instinct. When instinct dulls, patterns hide in plain sight. There were missing pieces nobody knew were missing. The FBI's role in counterintelligence, especially domestically, meant the CIA and Bureau shared responsibility for insider threats. But the marriage was rocky. Jurisdictions overlapped, egos clashed, secrets were hoarded. A CIA officer might whisper concerns about leaks. An FBI counterpart might think the agency was covering operational sloppiness. The inverse happened too. The result was a gray space where a determined insider could live comfortably. By the early 1980s, as Reagan ramped up pressure on the Soviet Union, money and tempo increased. That should have helped. It also made blind spots more dangerous. The push for more sources, more access, more product pushed caution to the margins. A few assets quietly disappeared from schedules. A few cable threads grew thin. Explanations were easy. Crackdowns, random arrests, bad luck. Moscow is hard. You don't win every inning. But there was one problem. The pattern wasn't random. A handful of assets in different compartments stopped reporting in ways that echoed each other. Surveillance in Moscow behaved too precisely. Brush passes failed not because of chance, but because somebody knew the brush point. Langley didn't see it yet, or wouldn't. The excuses still held, until bodies started dropping and the phones rang before dawn. Then the old assumptions collapsed like stage props. The storm wasn't coming. It was already inside. Vanishing voices. The Moscow losses begin. 3 days after those phones lit up, Moscow Station tried to treat it like a rough patch. Meets were rescheduled, then reshaped. A handler ran a longer SDR, added a misdirection turn, and still arrived to a bench that stayed empty. The jack-in-the-box trick pop out of a car after a decoy run flopped twice in a row. Dead drops that used to sing came back silent. An encoded note said the asset had weather, a code word for surveillance. and then nothing. It felt like winter had settled into the Tradecraft itself. Inside the station, the first instinct was tactical: tighten routes, cut extraneous communications, shift meeting sites outside familiar patterns. The case officers pulled hard on every lever they controlled. They assumed the KGB had improved coverage or gotten lucky. Moscow was designed to embarrass confidence. You plan for that. You absorb the punch. You go again. Headquarters read the traffic and agreed. This looked like enhanced surveillance pressure, not betrayal. Except the pattern didn't unwind. A source who had never missed a dead drop failed twice in a week. Another, who preferred brush passes near crowds, sent a prearranged signal, then didn't show. A third whispered through a shortwave burst that he'd been stopped twice by traffic police, who asked the same odd question about his trunk. He broke contact days later. None of those events proved compromise on their own. Together, they sounded like a rhythm someone else was conducting. Handlers started writing into the void. They left chalk marks and tiny chips of tape on pipes, the old signals that said, "I'm here, are you?" They waited entire nights in stairwells and alley recesses where the cold leaks through your gloves and the silence grows loud. One officer kept a folded note in his pocket, a plea to a source to run, to burn the escape plan they'd never wanted to use. He never used it. He couldn't find the hand to pass it to. At Langley, the memos grew more careful. Words like anomalous and persistent pressure replaced "dennied meeting" and possible compromise. Analysis tried to find other explanations. Maybe a Soviet internal crackdown on corruption had tangled their people. Maybe a targeted surveillance campaign had prioritized foreigners near certain neighborhoods tied to sensitive ministries. The logic worked on paper. It soothed for a week. Then news slipped through channels that one of the missing assets had been arrested. Nobody said the word betrayal out loud yet. It hangs like a curse, because once you say it, the universe of problems shifts from fixable tactics to something that empties rooms and careers. If there was a mole, everything they touched became suspect. Meet sites, signal sites, cover identities, vehicle plates, even the rhythms of who liked to meet on Tuesdays. For now, the station kept pushing. Change the day, change the face, change the bag, try again. Meanwhile, the KGB tightened the coil. Western surveillance detection routes that seemed clever started returning the same faces at the last turn, as if the watchers had the script. Officers noticed their tires chalked. A doorman who never looked up started greeting by name. A taxi reappeared 6 blocks from where it had dropped someone an hour earlier. These were tells. The problem was scale. When the entire city feels like a tell, you stop trusting your own eyes. Families got pulled into the drag without warning. One source's wife received an unmarked envelope with a photograph of her husband stepping toward a subway entrance, nothing else. Another got a call at work from someone asking about a fictitious business deal her husband wanted to finalize. That meant the KGB wasn't just watching, it was probing psyches. Push the fear inward, make the home a pressure chamber, and watch the asset choose safety over service. Some did, some tried to ride it out. The brave ones joined the dead ones in the space of a month. The station's senior officer asked for a full Tradecraft autopsy. If the KGB was simply better, then the failures would scatter. But the misses clustered around operations with very specific access: military R&D, party inner circles, and certain defense industrial ministries. That shouldn't have been obvious to an external adversary unless someone had handed them the thread. The quiet word reached Langley: stop assuming pressure. Assume compromise until proven otherwise. A mole hunt is a decision, not a reaction. It means you start looking at your colleagues like puzzles. The Special Investigations Unit wasn't fully stood up yet, but informal steps kicked in. Quiet surveillance of officers with unusual patterns, audits of travel claims, polygraph retests for those with Moscow ties. It poisoned hallways fast. A joke at the coffee machine landed like an accusation. People carried themselves like their shadows had weight. Still, there were operational problems to solve in real time. The station had to cut contact with high-risk sources while signaling that cut was temporary, not abandonment. That's harder than it sounds. A source who believes he's burned might run. A source who believes he's safe will keep meeting and die. Case officers wrote cables that turned into prayers, crafting lines that would survive KGB eyes if intercepted, while still reaching their person with a coded emotional truth. Go to ground, we will find you. Here's where the human cost got sharp. One handler had cultivated a mid-level engineer who'd slowly opened a window into a program Washington barely understood. The anxiety crept into everything: sleep, speech, even the way hands hovered over doorknobs. Because once you sense betrayal, your body keeps score. They had rituals. A certain brand of matchbook placed at a certain kiosk meant all clear. That matchbook never appeared again. Weeks later, a Soviet newspaper reported a treason trial in a small column. Names weren't printed, but the city and workplace matched. The handler went quiet for 2 days and came back looking a decade older. What nobody knew at the time was that the bleed wasn't a single cut. It was layered. Some operations were compromised because of what Aldrich Ames had already sold. Identities, meeting methods, even lists of who mattered most. Others were exposed by tradecraft patterns the KGB had learned to exploit. A few may have been revealed by separate penetrations or inadvertent leaks. To the people in the fight, it felt like one wave. In reality, it was converging currents, smashing boats against the same reef. Headquarters started to accept the word they'd been avoiding: betrayal. The next question was where. If it was inside the station, you shutter everything. If it was in Langley, the infection could run for miles. Some leaders argued for a full stop, halt all Moscow operations, start over from zeros. Others warned that a vacuum helps the adversary. They compromised like bureaucracies do: a partial pause, a triage of sources by risk and value, and a synchronized internal review. Meanwhile, Moscow kept bleeding. A brush pass near a cemetery that had worked 10 times failed in a way that smelled scripted. Pedestrian traffic too dense at the exact minute. A police van idling with windows fogged on a cold night. 2 men lighting cigarettes in sequence by the far gate. A planned rollover to a new communication channel fell apart because the cache site had been disturbed. The dirt packed too neatly after random construction work. Inside the building, a young officer wrote a line that stuck: "Our maps are lying to us." He meant the mental maps, the confidence diagrams that said this route is safe, this source is clean, this pressure is normal. Those maps were built on trust, and trust was the contested terrain. When trust collapses, organizations either cling to habit or accept the vertigo and relearn how to walk. Langley chose vertigo, late and reluctantly. The mole hunt would get an official name, a task force, and rules that turned friendships into evidence. But it started here, with vanishing voices and handlers whispering apologies to no one in stairwells. The excuses were gone. Bodies were dropping. The storm had a return address, and someone inside had stamped it. The mole hunt ignites. The Special Investigations, Dragnet. They didn't announce it with a memo. They started by moving desks. A small office with no windows, filled with people who knew how to read fear in spreadsheets. They called it Special Investigations. Its mandate was simple and brutal: assume betrayal and prove otherwise. Everyone with access to Moscow operations came under the same cold light: case officers, support officers, analysts, techs, even secretaries whose hands had touched routing slips. The feeling in the halls changed in a week. Suspicion became the air. Stakes came first. If a mole sat close to Moscow cases, every meeting site, every signal plan, every alias was compromised retroactively. That meant lives, not just operations. The dragnet had to be wide and fast. They pulled financial disclosures from the past decade and flagged anomalies: debt that didn't match salary, sudden improvements in lifestyle, cash deposits inconsistent with declared sources. Quiet knocks went out to banks under legal orders. They looked for new cars in old driveways, private school tuition that didn't line up, vacations that never hit the leave calendar. Then came the polygraphs. People who'd passed them for years got called back for lifestyle retests. The questions tilted subtle. Have you ever disclosed classified information to an unauthorized person? Have you ever concealed a significant relationship with a foreign national? Are you withholding information from this test? Polygraphs don't read truth, they read stress. But in a building where stress had become baseline, the charts lit up like switchboards. Examiners circled spikes and wrote, Inconclusive. Inconclusive became suspicion. Suspicion became surveillance. They installed quiet cameras near parking lots. They ran low-key tails on colleagues who never thought they'd feel a tail. A senior officer with a stiff back noticed the same sedan 2 mornings in a row and stopped sleeping. A young reports officer started timing her coffee breaks because she didn't want to look like she was avoiding anyone. The building felt like a submarine after a depth charge. No damage you could point to, just a wobble in every step. Culture buckled. The jokes died first, then the potlucks. Finally, the casual hallway advice that made operations flexible. A chief who'd spent 20 years telling younger officers to trust their gut now told them to log their instincts as data points. Friendships cooled because a warm conversation could look like collusion on a surveillance tape. Marriages took hits, too. One couple, both agency, started alternating which one spoke at dinner, as if an unseen stenographer might misinterpret overlap. That's how it gets inside you. The dragnet needed focus, so they did a Tradecraft autopsy. They laid out the failed meets like a crime board, maps, photos, timestamps, surveillance patterns. They asked a blunt question. Where did the KGB do the impossible? They saw something they shouldn't have seen, brush points that weren't predictable, cache sites known to 4 people, sources who shouldn't have been connected by any thread besides being valuable. That suggested insight from inside. But they also found operator habits that had crept in, preferred days, favored alleys, the kind of tiny shortcuts that feel like mastery until they're patterns. The answer wasn't either or, it was both and. False leads piled up. An officer with a second mortgage and late credit card payments looked perfect on paper. They put him under for 3 months, burned his weekends, and nearly ended his marriage. He was clean. Another had a quiet friendship with a foreign journalist. That spun into 3 weeks of whispers and a bruised reputation. She'd been a source, not a lover, and the reporting had saved a life once. Even so, the friendship never recovered. Each misfire cost the unit credibility, while the clock kept ticking on real damage. Political heat arrived fast. Briefings to the Hill grew tense. The White House wanted assurance that the agency wasn't reliving the Angleton years, when one man's paranoia froze the bloodstream. Leaders at Langley said the right words: disciplined, targeted, time-bound. Behind closed doors, they were scared of 2 ghosts at once, missing the mole or becoming the mole. They set rules. No single person could lock a career in a drawer. Every lead required corroboration that didn't rely on polygraph charts alone. Damage assessments would separate tradecraft failure from insider betrayal. Meanwhile, the KGB continued to act like they had the playbook. That turned the Bureau's gaze inward too. CIA and FBI started comparing notes under strain. Jurisdictional lines got redrawn by necessity. The Bureau ran domestic surveillance on suspects with agency ties, 1 floor separated from officers who'd trained with those suspects. Phone calls got colder. Those who'd spent years ribbing each other about turf now watched their words like they were passing secrets across a border. What nobody in the rank and file saw was the spreadsheet that changed everything. One analyst in special investigations overlaid bank data with operational timelines. She flagged cash deposits that lined up suspiciously with Moscow asset arrests. The sums weren't subtle, thousands in cash, wrapped in just enough legitimate income to look plausible, hitting accounts days after particular sources went silent. The names connected to those accounts were not yet clear. But the pattern said someone was trading names for money, not once, but repeatedly. They pulled travel records next. Who was in a position to know those names at those times? Who had been briefed into those compartments and also had reason to need cash? The list narrowed. Mid-level case officers with Moscow portfolios, a few supervisors, a tech support officer who'd installed secure comms for certain operations. Special investigations started watching body language in footage from badge cameras. Who avoided who sped up after certain conversations, who waited to enter an elevator alone. Here's where the process got dangerous. Once a hypothesis gelled, confirmation bias became a trap. To fight it, they built a red team inside the team, officers tasked to prove the favorite suspect innocent. If the red team couldn't break the suspicion with data, the lead moved forward, It saved at least 2 careers and 1 marriage. It didn't stop the bleed. Moscow still reported silence. Pressure mounted to name a name. A deputy director asked for a list, top to bottom. The head of special investigations pushed back and delivered buckets instead. High, medium, low, unknown. It frustrated everyone who wanted a scalp. But it kept the process from turning into office politics with badges. Into those buckets, one name kept floating upward. An officer with access to crown jewels, spending above his pay grade, slipping through polygraphs with charm and practiced ease. He wasn't alone in those characteristics. He just aligned with the money in ways others didn't. They ran a full surveillance box around him, morning drives recorded, lunches watched, trash pulled, mail photographed. He bought a nice bottle of wine on a Tuesday for no occasion, then paid cash. He started wearing better suits. He talked about refinancing. None of it was proof. All of it sang the same note. Special investigations didn't know yet they were closing on the quiet betrayal that had gutted Moscow. They only knew the pattern finally had a face. While that net tightened, the rest of the building lived with the consequences. Promotions paused. Assignments got delayed. Sources overseas felt the lag and sometimes paid for it. A senior officer stopped a hallway conversation and said, "Write it down or don't say it." That line traveled like contraband wisdom. The dragnet had become the story. And in the background, the KGB kept acting like the shadows belonged to them. When the day came to move on the suspect, the unit felt equal parts relief and dread. If they were right, the bleeding might slow. If they were wrong, the wound would widen. Either way, the agency had crossed a line. Trust was no longer the baseline. Doubt had become doctrine. The mole hunt wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was a mirror, and everyone had to look. Aldrich Ames, the quiet betrayal that gutted Moscow. He didn't look like a crisis. Mid-level, rumpled, with a drinker's bloat and a charm that came and went with the hour, Aldrich Ames had exactly the kind of access that makes damage invisible until it's fatal. He knew who mattered inside the Soviet system because he'd recruited and handled some of them. He read the cables that distilled their lives into intelligence. He sat in rooms where names were said out loud, then folded back into compartments that were supposed to be airtight. Debt pressed on him. Pride pressed harder. That combination has wrecked more empires than artillery. The story starts small. In 1985, Ames walked himself into the KGB's arms. No elaborate entrapment, no honeyed approach. He made the first move. He brought a sample to prove value. Names. Those names were currency with a brutal exchange rate. The Soviets paid cash. He took envelopes that felt like solutions to every nagging bill and every nagging slight. He told himself it was manageable, compartmented, a transaction among professionals. Then the money started changing his life, in ways even a dull auditor could spot. Get this, he stopped hiding it well. He deposited cash in chunks that should have triggered alarms. He bought a new house beyond his declared means, paid off debts, treated friends, upgraded suits. He joked about a windfall. Bankers saw deposits as deposits. Supervisors saw a gregarious officer talking big and drinking bigger. Polygraphs. He'd failed before and recovered with explanations and a second chance. Charm plus policy inertia equals a pass. He knew the system he was robbing. He helped write parts of it. Meanwhile, Moscow bled. Within months of his first contact, assets began to roll up. Not all at once, strategic pointers first, so the pattern wouldn't scream, but the crown jewels went dark. A colonel who'd fed military plans for years was arrested. A scientist with access to R&D vanished. A party insider stopped signaling and never resurfaced. The KGB ran the arrests in a way that mocked CIA tradecraft, staggered timing, controlled leaks, quiet trials. From afar, it looked like opaque Soviet churn. Up close, it looked choreographed. Here's the twist that hurt morale most. Ames didn't sell methods. He sold people. He handed over identities knowing exactly what would happen. Some were executed. Some were imprisoned for life. Some were turned into propaganda. The human weight of that choice sat nowhere visible on a balance sheet. Inside CIA offices, case officers read the damage assessments and recognized handwriting. They'd written some of the cables that built those dossiers. They felt complicit and powerless in the same breath. So why didn't the alarms peg earlier? Blind spots stacked. Ames's supervisors knew his drinking and his uneven performance. That made him look like a management problem, not a national security threat. Financial anomalies got waved off in a culture that still treated lifestyle checks as formalities. Polygraphs gave false comfort with their own mythology. Fail once, pass again, call it nerves. Groupthink did the rest. He was one of us, the kind of officer you rescue rather than suspect. Special investigations tightened the box around him after those bank timelines lined up with asset arrests. They didn't move fast. They couldn't afford a miss. They watched him shop, tracked conversations, mapped commutes. They saw patterns that matched classic agent behavior, seemingly purposeless drives, sudden turns, pauses near parks where dead drops could sit for hours. They found garbage with traces of tradecraft, torn paper, careful burn patterns, mundane items that looked too curated to be accidental. Still, the case needed corroboration beyond inference, so the team widened the net to his communications and his contacts. They built a picture of his time in Rome, where his access had been deep and his finances had first started shifting. They pulled on threads that ran through his marriage and his social circles. They studied his confidence in small moments, how he answered open-ended questions, how he deflected timelines, how he shrugged when asked about Moscow as if the bleeding were an act of nature. Meanwhile, the KGB kept collecting on his treachery. Ames continued delivering names through the late 80s, then into the early 90s, as if the Cold War's end were a cosmetic remodel rather than a structural shift. His betrayal straddled the fall of the Soviet Union, proving a grim point. Ideology wasn't the only motive, and geopolitics didn't retire greed. The operational effect stayed brutal. CIA's Soviet division, later Russia division, was operating with a hollowed-out source base, trying to rebuild while the floorboards still creaked. This was the moment everything changed, the morning grab. After months of surveillance and internal legal choreography, the FBI and CIA coordinated a clean takedown in 1994. They boxed him in on his commute, pulled him out of his car, and read rights that felt more like an obituary for a decade. In interviews, he didn't spin legends. He gave a flat confession that landed like a dull hammer. Yes, he'd spied. Yes, he'd taken money. Yes, he knew what the names meant. He wrapped it in grievances, underappreciation, career stagnation, the usual poison that tastes like justification. The damage assessment that followed wasn't just a list. It was a memorial. They counted operations degraded or destroyed. They listed code names that now belonged to prisons or Grav. They mapped secondary effects, the sources those sources would have brought, the insights analysis never got, the policy choices made in the dark because someone had flicked the switch. The tally stretched beyond Moscow. Liaison services saw the pattern and pulled back, wondering if sharing with the CIA was a risk to their own people. Inside Langley, the soul-searching turned into paperwork with teeth. How did Ames pass polygraphs after failing? Why did financial flags get waved away? Who signed off on travel and access for an officer living beyond his pay grade? Managers who protected him out of habit or misplaced loyalty found themselves under scrutiny. The post-mortem didn't treat this as a singular monster problem. It treated it as a systems problem. Systems had trained people to ignore the odd because the odd was awkward. And get this, catching Ames didn't stop the leaks. Even as he went into a cell, operations kept feeling pressure that didn't align with his access alone. That meant there was another hole, maybe more than one, and it might not be in the same building. The CIA had to live with the cognitive dissonance of victory and failure in the same headline. They'd nailed the man who wrecked Moscow, and yet Moscow still moved like someone else had the keys. Ames's story forced the agency to confront its own self-image. They were not just hunters, they were vulnerable. They could be beaten by a colleague's hunger and an adversary's patience. They had to accept that counterintelligence wasn't a season of penance, it was the climate. Elevate CI from compliance to craft. Treat lifestyle reviews as intelligence operations, not HR chores. Stop worshipping polygraphs as talismans. Build financial monitoring that can read context, not just numbers. Reward officers who ask corrosive questions before clapping for those who bring shiny sources. For the people who'd carried the human cost, reforms felt late and necessary. One case officer kept a list of first names of sources lost after 1985 pinned behind a cabinet door, invisible to visitors but impossible for him to ignore. When Ames's face hit the news, he closed the door a little harder. At sentencing, the narrative was clean: traitor, greed, betrayal. Inside the building, the narrative was messier. We let this happen because we liked being comfortable. Meanwhile, his confession gave investigators a reference point. They used it to close loops to confirm which compromises were his and which were something else. The something else kept pointing across the river to another institution with its own culture and its own blind spots. The hunt wasn't over. It was changing shape. And while Ames sat behind bars, the real lesson settled in. You can arrest a man. You can't arrest complacency. The cleanup would take years. The scars would last longer. And the second knife was already out. The second knife, Robert Hanssen and the FBI's shadow war. While Langley tried to breathe after Ames, another leak kept whispering through operations that shouldn't have been touched. CIA fixed procedures, tightened compartments, and still, sources burned in ways that didn't map to Ames's confessed reach. The psychological toll was immediate. Old instincts felt contaminated, and even routine briefings tasted like risk. Suspicion drifted across the river. The Bureau's counterintelligence shop guarded domestic lanes and watched foreign services on US soil. If a second knife existed, it might be strapped under an FBI desk. Robert Hanssen didn't look like a fire. He looked like a church-going, rule-quoting career man who could recite Bureau policy from memory and scowl at anyone who bent it. He'd been in and around counterintelligence since the late 70s, absorbing how the Soviets hunted and how the US hunted back. He knew the CIA's rhythms from liaison, knew which programs lived behind extra doors, and crucially, knew where the seams between agencies turned sharp. That seam knowledge was a key. He used it for himself. His method was suburban calm weaponized. No dramatic meets in smoky alleys. He favored dead drops near parks, bridges, and wooded strips that looked like weekend jogging routes. Packages wrapped in plastic, taped with care, tucked under footbridges or behind signs. He wrote letters to the KGB and later the SVR with a pedant's flourish. Precise, condescending, sometimes lecturing them on tradecraft like a tutor correcting a student. He encrypted some notes, masked others behind simple codes. He insisted on no face-to-face contact. He sold secrets with the arrogance of a man who believed he'd never be measured. Stakes: he had keys to rooms the CIA couldn't enter without a visitor badge. He touched FBI cases that monitored Soviet and later Russian officers in the US, saw human source reporting routed for deconfliction, and read technical program summaries that sketched capabilities in careful language. That meant his betrayals could expose CIA sources by triangulation, connect the who with the how, and deduce the where. It also meant he could tell the Russians which American programs were blind spots, which ones weren't, and where to push. Meanwhile, CIA analysts trying to square post-Ames anomalies kept finding leak signatures that felt domestic. Programs unrelated to Ames's compartments suffered odd interference. A source in Eastern Europe got nudged by a counterintelligence move that smelled like foreknowledge, not luck. A technical effort aimed at a foreign embassy saw equipment mysteriously degrade after a routine maintenance window. None of that proved an insider at the Bureau. But it pointed toward a second insider somewhere, and the spotlight moved. Rivalry didn't help. CIA and FBI had long memories and fresh bruises. The agency suspected the Bureau of hoarding. The Bureau suspected the agency of freelancing. Meetings where they shared just enough turned brittle. Now add fear. If the mole sat inside the FBI, then every word said to the wrong ear was another loss. If the mole didn't, accusing the Bureau risked tearing the partnership when they needed it most. Leaders tried to choreograph joint reviews without igniting turf fires. It half-worked on good days. Hanssen exploited the grey. He'd been selling since around 1979 in intermittent bursts, pausing when risk felt high, resuming when the heat cooled. He took cash, diamonds, and the one currency he craved most, validation that he was smarter than his peers. He wrapped his motives in talk about ideology and bureaucratic rot, but the ledger always balanced in his favor. He warned his Russian handlers how to handle him. Never try to meet, keep the system elegant, keep him anonymous. He signed as Ramon at times, a ghost with instructions. Impact arrived in ripples that became waves. US sources in Moscow and beyond surfaced in Russian files at moments that didn't correlate with Ames's access. Technical programs got burned in ways that suggested inside detail, not educated guesswork. A double-agent operation run by the Bureau fell apart with unnatural speed. CIA's liaison with the FBI on certain sensitive compartments got curiously leaky. The agency tightened. The leaks persisted elsewhere. The effect was corrosive. You start asking whether your partner is compromised, and that question infects every plan. Parallel tracks formed. CIA kept cleaning post-Ames house and red-teaming its own assumptions. The Bureau, pressured by evidence and by the CIA's increasingly pointed questions, formed internal cells to hunt a traitor among their own. The Bureau had to sneak up on itself. That meant compartmented teams, unusual for a culture that relies on chain of command and case ownership. It meant watching veteran agents without tipping them. It meant living with a kind of institutional vertigo that Langley already knew too well. Here's where the plot tightened. A file surfaced from Russian hands years after the Soviet collapse, purchased at real cost. It contained fragments, letters from the unknown FBI mole, operational details, Tradecraft notes, a sliver of a fingerprint on habit, not ink. The voice on the page sounded like a man who loved rules as a language he could weaponize. He criticized the Russians for sloppy security while giving them gold. He bragged without names. He left enough metadata for careful minds to chase. The Bureau built a profile that fit too neatly to ignore. Senior CI experience, access to specific cases that lined up with burned operations, a personality that could write with superiority and insist on control. They added a technical breadcrumb. A Palm Pilot used by the suspect contained fragments of encrypted files. On its own, not a smoking gun, but another chord in the same song. Surveillance wrapped around Hanssen's suburban routine, church, office, home, a park that would matter later. They let him run a little longer to see the pattern in motion. He drove to parks with a bag that always looked slightly heavier than its size. He paused near a footbridge in Foxstone Park, a place he'd used before, a place that felt like his private stage. He checked for tails with the quiet competence of a man who wrote the checklist years ago. He still missed details because arrogance blinds the best operator. The Bureau had hidden in places he didn't think to look. The takedown had its own choreography. They picked a day he believed was safe, let him place a package at the drop, and closed the ring in a parking lot as he walked away. No drawn guns in the cinematic sense, controlled, fast, words that felt like iron. He asked, "What took you so long?" according to those there. That line, true or polished by memory, captured the tone of his letters. He wanted the last shot to sound clever. He didn't get it. Damage assessments read like echoes of Ames with a Bureau accent. Which sources burned through his reach? Which technical programs lost years of cover? Which joint operations took hits because he telegraphed their edges? The tally stretched across agencies and across time. It included lives, careers, and capabilities honed at great cost. It also included trust between CIA and FBI, between operators and their own institutions. Hanssen had turned the rivalry into a weapon. He made them doubt each other to survive him. Two moles, two cultures cut open, one problem that now looked structural. You could lock up Ames and Hanssen, but you couldn't lock up the conditions that let them thrive. Gaps between agencies, overconfidence in internal vetting, and the habit of mistaking compliance for security. The Bureau reworked its insider threat posture. The CIA pushed harder on joint counterintelligence centers, and both tried to stitch a seam that had become a wound. It wasn't a victory lap, it was triage. And for operators still on the street, the lesson landed practical. Assume the adversary studies your partnership as closely as your tradecraft. Assume the second knife is already in play. Build your plans so a single betrayal hurts but doesn't blind. The shadow war wasn't agency versus agency. It was the inside versus everyone else. The reckoning inside Langley. Culture, hubris, and broken systems. By the time Hanssen's cuffs clicked, the mood at Langley wasn't relief. It was a dull, necessary anger turned inward, shame braided with determination. Postmortems became the daily grind. Not the kind that writes a clean narrative. This was a line-by-line audit of the agency's beliefs. Incentives got the first hit. For years, the machine rewarded product, not prudence. A neat briefing beat a messy question. The operator who brought a new source got applause. The CI officer who asked if the source was clean got side-eye. Compliance sat in the chair where curiosity used to sit. Checklists had replaced conversations. You could pass a polygraph and pass a financial form and pass a refresher course and still be a problem. Managers learned to read green lights as security rather than as minimum thresholds. That blindness wasn't malicious, it was comfortable. Tools turned into talismans. The polygraph's aura did the worst damage. It made people lazy about asking the harder thing, does this story make sense? The Ames mess had proved the danger. Hanssen made it embarrassing. Both made it unforgivable. CI had long been treated like an immune system you suppress because it makes you itch. The reckoning flipped that. Counterintelligence became the blood work, not the aspirin. The agency elevated CI posts, routed sensitive operations through officers trained to think adversarially, and forced red teams into planning rooms where they'd been whispered about but rarely invited. It wasn't theater. It was survival. You don't catch a future Ames by hoping he twitches on a graph. You catch him by building processes that punish assumption. Tech fetish took its licks too. Satellites and sensors had earned their place, but the aftermath proved the cost of treating them as a cure-all. The agency had leaned hard on imagery and signals, while HUMINT atrophied under pressure. That imbalance made it easy to believe that Moscow's bleeding could be offset by cleaner pictures elsewhere. It never worked. The reformers pushed a different model, used tech to enable humans, not replace them. The Moscow rules got rewritten in a digital font. Assume every byte leaves a trail, and every trail is read by a thinking adversary. Management failures marched across whiteboards, who ignored bank flags, who signed off on travel for officers living a lifestyle their paycheck couldn't plausibly support, who protected the charming problem instead of pulling his thread. The answers rarely ended in villainy. They ended in culture, a tendency to think he's one of us, a reluctance to escalate because escalation creates paperwork and enemies, a habit of shielding promising officers from their own consequences. That habit wouldn't survive the purge. The human cost drove it home. Damage assessments weren't numbers to the people who'd held those sources, hands. Officers who'd watched assets disappear now sat in rooms where lawyers discussed liability and executives discussed optics. Allies came to town with lists of their own, operations they'd run with the agency that had failed in patterns they didn't like, trust accounts they wanted to close if they didn't get straight answers. The CIA's reputation for competence had been part of America's power. It took a hit you could feel in diplomatic traffic. Public glare helped and hurt. Media coverage kept pressure on, but it also flattened nuance into scandal soundbites. Congress hauled leaders in for hearings that demanded both contrition and a plan. The agency tried to walk it without tripping. We failed in ways that were systematic. We will change in ways that are structural. No promises of perfection, promises of doubt as doctrine. It landed unevenly. The world wanted a guarantee. The agency could only offer guardrails. Inside, reforms got sharp. Financial monitoring upgraded from annual snapshots to continuous evaluation for those with sensitive access. Not just big deposits, patterns, debt profiles, lifestyle tells that didn't match declared means. Travel audits stopped being rubber stamps. Randomized, adversarial reviews cut across directorates. Your friend couldn't sign your clean bill of health. Rotations through CI became career builders, not cul-de-sacs for the paranoid. Debrief programs for departing officers expanded and grew teeth. Departures became intelligence events, not office parties. The polygraph didn't get tossed, it got demoted. Its role turned narrow, a tool among tools, never a verdict. Training emphasized interrogation craft over machine mystique. New modules taught cognitive traps, confirmation bias, halo effects, sunk cost thinking, and forced officers to practice breaking their own arguments. Performance reviews embedded challenge as a metric. If you never slowed an operation with a CI concern, that was no longer a compliment. Tradecraft took a hard reset. The Moscow rules: don't run patterns, assume everything is watched, trust signals not instincts, got rewritten for a world where surveillance could be digital, persistent, and patient. Surveillance detection routes added time and tech hygiene. Brush passes moved less often through habit trails and more often through opportunistic windows created by environmental triggers, not calendars. Dead drops got redesigned with sensors and crosschecks that could warn of compromise without revealing the site. Need to know tightened in practice, not just policy. Access lists shrank, and compartmentation stopped being a courtesy exception for seniority. Liaison relationships needed repair. Partners who'd lost people because of US moles wanted more than apologies. They wanted structure. The agency built frameworks for joint CI vetting, shared risk assessments, and bilateral drills that tested insider threat posture rather than just external threat response. Trust doesn't regrow on wishes. It regrows on routines that catch liars the same way in both languages. Culture is always the slowest code to rewrite. Leaders tried to model the new posture, praise the question that slows the room, reward the officer who catches her own blind spot, promote the manager who pulls a favorite off a case for cause. They made small public rituals of humility, post-mortem Brownsbag sessions where senior officers unpacked their own misses without euphemism. The message was fear everything. It was interrogate your certainty. Not everyone bought in. Some veterans heard healthy paranoia and remembered Angleton's freeze. They had scars from the era when suspicion ate the mission. The counter was specific: guardrails, peer checks, time limits, external review. A CI surge without brakes is a purge. A CI surge with brakes is a backbone. That line became a mantra. It kept reform from becoming a witch hunt while ensuring it didn't soften into slogans. Here's where the reckoning touched identity. The agency liked the myth of the quiet professional who outthinks the enemy and outweights the storm. The betrayals showed a mirror. The quiet professional can also outsmart himself, ignore friction, and call it wisdom. The new identity made room for the uncomfortable colleague, the one who says, "Prove it again." That voice used to get labeled difficult. Now it got labeled essential. In the background, the joint scene with the Bureau got restitched. The creation of combined counterintelligence centers gave both sides shared oxygen. Analysts and operators from CIA and FBI sat in the same rooms, looking at the same anomalies, arguing with the same data. It didn't erase rivalry. It civilized it. Disagreements became structured, logged, and adjudicated with rules both had signed. The seam that Hanssen exploited became less of a gap and more of a welded joint. The reckoning didn't promise safety. It promised resilience. You assume there will be another insider. You design so the blast radius is smaller. You build detection early, response fast, recovery honest. You measure success not by how quiet the scandal pages stay, but by how quickly you spot the first off note and how willing you are to stop the music. The lesson that started with vanishing voices and ended with two men in cells wasn't about monsters. It was about mirrors. And the building finally looked. Rebuilding the shield. Reforms, tradecraft, and the hunt for resilience. Rebuilding started in the least cinematic place possible: forms, schedules, and permissions. The agency rewired who could see what and when. Need to know went from slogan to operating system. Access lists shrank to names that could be defended in a briefing with the director. Seniority stopped buying open doors. Justification did. Cross-compartment, just for awareness. Briefings got killed unless they survived a CI review that asked, what does this person add besides risk? Structural shifts landed next. Counterintelligence moved up the chain, not as an advisory speed bump, but as a partner with veto power. Operations had to route plans through CI cells staffed by people trained to think like thieves. Those cells weren't there to wave risk through. They were paid to break plans, then help rebuild them stronger. A joint CIA-FBI counterintelligence center made the seam a workspace. Shared databases, shared analysts, shared grudges aired in the open. If a pattern touched both owned it. Vetting got teeth. Annual checks turned continuous for those with sensitive access. Financial monitoring stopped being a paper chase and became a live feed of risk indicators. Debt ratios out of whack with rank, cash-heavy deposits, sudden asset acquisition, hidden business interests. The algorithm didn't accuse, it alerted. Alerts triggered human review from teams trained to separate a new baby's expenses from a new Bentley. A clean polygraph no longer quieted a flashing dashboard. Lifestyle polygraphs narrowed their aim and widened their context. Examiners trained on cognitive interviewing and baseline behavior analysis, not just needles on paper. Failing didn't convict, passing didn't absolve. Results went into a mosaic: finances, travel, reporting quality, peer observations, performance swings. Managers who treated polygraphs as absolution found themselves corrected in meetings that used to be polite. The message changed. Machines don't bless you. Your life has to make sense. Travel itself got reframed. No more rubber-stamped TDYs with fuzzy purpose statements. Every trip tied to an intelligence requirement, a CI plan, and a debrief schedule that mined experience like an operation, not a vacation slideshow. Post-travel reviews looked for oddities, unexpected meetings, changes in demeanor, subtle increases in risk-taking. If a trip coincided with an adversary's sudden awareness, the traveler had to account for every hour they could, not as punishment. As pattern control, Tradecraft rebounded like a discipline rediscovered. The Moscow rules, assume surveillance, avoid pattern, respect time, got digitized and deepened. Surveillance detection routes added environmental triggers and digital hygiene. Leave devices off-grid, avoid Wi-Fi honey traps, scrub metadata tails that rat out routines. Rush passes adapted to cities mapped by cameras and analytics. Timing became liquid, keyed to events the adversary couldn't predict, not calendars they could. Dead drops gained sensors that whispered if they'd been touched, and parallel signals that let handlers abort without touching compromised ground. Communication shifted from clever to humble. Fewer channels, tighter encryption, clearer fallbacks. Cool gave way to provable. Case officers learned to audit their own comms with CI graders who treated convenience like contraband. If a plan needed 4 exceptions to policy, the plan died. The new gospel, simple, survives. The KGB had exploited elegance masquerading as mastery. Now mastery looked like boring discipline. Inside teams, red cells became routine. Planning without a formal internal opponent became malpractice. Red cells had authority to delay, rewrite, or kill operations that couldn't survive adversarial review. They role-played the enemy with access to US bureaucracy. What would an insider see? What could a liaison infer? Where would a stressed officer cut a corner? They scripted betrayals and forced blue teams to absorb them without collapsing. It felt cruel. It built muscle. Recruiting shifted pace and posture. Ambition still mattered. Sources win wars, but the tempo slowed to match modern counterintelligence realities. Case officers trained to tolerate the ache of not moving, to sit on a near recruit until the CI picture cleared. Managers learned to reward pauses. In the old days, that could stall a career. In the rebuilt culture, restraint became a line on an evaluation, prevented a bad operation. Quiet heroism, measured in absences. Liaison with partners demanded contrition and structure. The agency offered shared risk frameworks, joint CI vetting for high-risk operations, reciprocal audits where partners could inspect US compartments touching their people, and bilateral insider threat drills that treated embarrassment as tuition. Some allies came in burned and left cautious, but they left with documents signed, not just sympathies expressed. Others demanded names of compromised operations. The agency gave what it could and accepted the cost. Certain channels would never reopen. Training remixed the curriculum. New officers learned the history not as law, but as warnings embedded in practical modules. Instructors walked them through Ames and Hanssen decisions from the inside out. The ignored bank flags, the charm that bought passes, the paperwork that hid rot. They ran labs on cognitive bias and bureaucratic gravity. They graded leadership, not on charisma, but on the willingness to stop the train when the ticket looked wrong. Even the admin stack got hardened. Badge logs, printer trails, document pulls, mundane data became a CI sensor grid. The goal wasn't to watch everyone all the time. It was to catch the out-of-pattern act early. That required privacy guardrails written with law and oversight in the room. The agency codified minimization rules to keep the gaze tight. Look at behavior tied to risk, not behavior tied to curiosity. The cure couldn't become its own disease. Culturally, language changed. Paranoia gave way to adversarial thinking. Leaders banned the phrase, "he's one of us," as a shield. They replaced it with "show me." Mentorship pairs included a CI voice as standard. Promotions boards added a question. When did this officer challenge consensus at cost to themselves? If the answer was never, the file dimmed. The building learned to clap for dissent when it saved time later. Across the river, the joint centers mattered as much as any internal fix. CIA and FBI analysts sat shoulder to shoulder, comparing anomalies in near real time. When a source hiccuped in Europe and a program blinked in DC, the correlation didn't wait for a quarterly meeting. Disagreements got documented, adjudicated, and archived where future hunts could find them. Hanssen had thrived in the seam. The welded joint didn't eliminate risk, it dennied him the darkness he'd used. None of this promised a world without betrayal. The rebuilt shield accepted the opposite. Betrayal is baked in, so design for it. Compartment for containment, not control freakery. Detect deviations early. Respond without panic. Debrief honestly so the scar tissue forms smart. The agency didn't aim to be unbreakable. It aimed to be break-resistant and repair-capable. Here's the quiet shift that mattered most. Doubt stopped being a mood and became doctrine. It sat in planning documents, in training slides, in hallway talk that used to worship swagger. Doubt asked, what if the story we like is wrong? It asked it early, so the answer didn't arrive as a headline. That's how you rebuild after a secret war against yourself. You decide not to be surprised by the enemy you hire. The world doesn't pause. End of the Cold War and shifting targets. The wall fell and the phones didn't stop. In 1989, the crowds in Berlin climbed concrete and history snapped. But inside Langley, the mood was part celebration, part caution. Ecstasy outside, guarded nerves inside. The empire they'd hunted for decades was cracking in broad daylight. That didn't mean the KGB forgot how to read a face. It meant the battlefield shape-shifted while the inside wounds still bled. Victory headlines don't cauterize betrayal. On paper, the mission got simpler. The Soviet Union broke into 15 flags, budgets thawed, and access looked easier than it had in a generation. Former officials reached out. Newly rich men with old ties wanted introductions. Archives whispered to anyone who could pay in dollars, visas, or attention. For HUMINT, it felt like the gates had opened. For Counterintelligence, it felt like a carnival promising free prizes with no fine print. There's always fine print. Moscow turned into Moscow plus everywhere. New states inherited fragments of security services and stockpiles of secrets. The SVR and FSB rose from KGB bones with fresh business cards and the same instincts. They studied the agency's trauma and adjusted their playbooks. The lesson they took from Ames and Hanssen was simple. Insiders are leverage, seams are opportunities, and patience beats noise. Meanwhile, CIA officers tried to convert Cold War sources into post-Cold War guides while keeping score of what had truly changed. The answer, less than it looked. Back home, priorities pivoted. The president's daily brief wanted fewer tank counts and more answers about loose nukes, proliferators, and cash flowing through black markets. Pakistan's networks, North Korea's ambitions, scientists selling expertise out of former Soviet labs. These became daily puzzles. HUMINT had to climb new ladders fast, sometimes in places where US coverage was thin and allies were wobbly. CI reminded them the adversary didn't retire with the Politburo. The new targets knew the old tricks and would write new ones. Terrorism pushed in from the margins. In the early 1990s, scattered warnings about groups with global reach competed with the intoxicating noise of a world solved. The agency built counter-terrorism cells, elevated them over time, and started recruiting into networks that weren't ministries with org charts, but families and faith circles with hard-to-map loyalties, where trust is emotional before it's operational. That required tradecraft built for intimacy, not bureaucracy. It also demanded relentless CI discipline, because penetration cuts both ways. A single bad recruit could turn a case officer into a courier for disinformation or a marked man on a foreign street. Cyber crept up like a hum you don't notice until the room's shaking. Classified systems multiplied, data sprawled, and access expanded to serve speed. IT contractors, administrators, and toolsmiths gained keys to vaults they didn't always appreciate. The insider threat model had to update. Greed and grievance now had USB ports. CI argued for segmentation before segmentation was a buzzword. Operations wanted access because access produces product. The compromise became architecture. Least privilege by default, logged privilege by exception, audits that meant something. The end of the Cold War brought a different kind of liaison. New intelligence services appeared overnight, some staffed by yesterday's KGB, others by patriots trying to define a nation. The agency had to choose where to invest, who to trust, and how to share with partners who might be penetrated before they printed their letterhead. Mistakes happened. A promising channel in one capital turned out to be a Russian echo chamber with a friendly smile. CI called for probationary trust, stepwise sharing tied to verifiable behavior. It slowed the romance. It saved bruises. At the same time, legacy vulnerabilities lingered. Names Ames had sold didn't resurrect with the flag change. Networks didn't sprout back because the map looked different. The damage baked into the 1985-1991 window kept paying out for years in gaps, angles of insight missing when the US needed them. Analysts writing on the Chechen wars, oligarch politics, and military reform in Russia had to lean on open sources and thin HUMINT while rebuilding took root. That forced humility into assessments. It also forced creativity. New sources came from places the old playbooks ignored. Accountants, telecom engineers, bodyguards, translators who heard things their bosses didn't mean to say. Meanwhile, China accelerated from long-term to now. Economic opening created cover and access for both sides. Beijing services absorbed Western case studies, including the CIA's hard lessons, and built a CI posture that married patience with volume. Recruiting inside China stayed brutally hard. Recruiting Chinese nationals abroad required exquisite CI framing because the state's reach could hit families back home. The doctrine of doubt had to travel with every approach. A gift-wrapped dangle could look like a dream in a conference coffee line. It might be a nightmare signed by a ministry. The Balkans lit up. Bosnia and later Kosovo demanded eyes on militias, arms routes, and war criminals weaving through shattered states. CT and CI collided in tight spaces, shared informants with mixed motivations, overlapping operations with allied services who didn't always play clean. The agency learned to grade allies case by case, not flag by flag, and to keep CI hand on the tiller even when the humanitarian impulse shouted, "Move." Moving fast without CI got people killed in the 80s. The lesson stuck. Here's where the tech optimism tugged again. Satellites streamed better pictures. Intercepts got richer. The seduction was psychological as much as technical. Clean data feels safer than messy humans. Analysts could see a world in layers unimaginable in 1979. The temptation was to assume that human reporting was a boutique add-on. The postmortem screamed the opposite. Machines show, people tell. A sensor can map a conv. A person can explain why it turned left. But if you don't protect the person and the chain that carries their words, you end up briefing beautiful gaps. The Cold War had taught that in blood. The 199s institutionalized it in Doctrine. Inside the building, career arcs bent. Rotations through CI and CT became standard for rising officers. The agency built tracks that produced hybrids, operators who could recruit in tough lanes and think adversarially about their own operations. Promotion boards asked for evidence of disciplined skepticism. Proved a negative, started to show up in reviews. Uncovered deception in a source before it burned down a cell. Killed a too-perfect lead that smelled of theater. That wasn't just culture change. It was capacity building for a threat model that assumed betrayal as a constant. Missed warnings still happened. Embassies were bombed in East Africa in 1998. The system had fragments, rumors, patterns, hints, but wasn't stitched tight enough to pull the thread early. Some of that failure traced to the newness of the CT structure, some to the complexity of the target, some to the age-old friction between collection and analysis. CI's role in that era looked different than in Moscow. It guarded against manipulation and insider compromise, while CT leaders hammered at speed. The balance was imperfect. The doctrine of doubt didn't mean paralysis. It meant insisting that fast didn't equal sloppy. And through it all, Russia didn't disappear. It rebranded. The services studied the US reforms, adapted, and probed the seams of a democracy balancing liberty with vigilance. They ran operations through financial channels, diaspora communities, and tech stacks that hadn't existed when the Berlin Wall stood. They remembered Ames and Hanssen not as luck, but as models. That's the quiet truth of the post-Cold War world. Adversaries learn from your worst days more than from your victories. So the agency walked into the new century with scar tissue and a sharper knife. The secret war against yourself doesn't stop because the flag on the Kremlin changed. It becomes the baseline. HUMINT ambition had to live alongside CI rigor, every approach paired with a question: who benefits if I'm wrong? The end of the Cold War wasn't an ending. It was a reset with new traps, new targets, and the same old human fault lines waiting to be tested. What Betrayal teaches: doctrine of doubt and the price of ignorance. Back to that uneasy truth the building finally learned to say out loud. Doubt isn't a mood, it's policy. Betrayal forced that shift. When insiders beat systems, the instinct is to add locks. Locks help, but locks without questions just slow the next thief. The doctrine that emerged was simple to say and hard to live. Trust, but verify inside the house every day with receipts, not as a slogan, as muscle memory. Institutional humility had to be engineered. You don't wake up humble after a decade of playing global chess and getting briefed in the West Wing. So leadership built humility into workflows. Plans got written with explicit assumption checks. 3 claims per operation that had to be challenged by someone not emotionally tied to the outcome. If an assumption survived a beating, it stayed. If it wilted, the plan bent. That turned doubt from a personality trait into a requirement. Here, where it bites. Doubt slows you when speed feels righteous. A tip arrives hot. A source wants to move. A policymaker wants a result by Friday. The doctrine demanded a pause for sanity checks, quick, structured, documented. CI officers learned to say, "Give me 90 minutes to break this," and operators learned to value that delay like body armor. In the Ames era, hesitation was called timidity. Afterward, hesitation became proof you understood the cost of being wrong. Balancing human ambition with CI rigor became the core tension. Talent wants to chase, the mission needs it, but recruitment goals now sat next to CI gates. A flashy access pitch didn't clear if the dangle profile glowed red. Too perfect, too convenient, too eager. Managers stopped rewarding raw recruit numbers. They rewarded well-lifed networks that survived time and pressure. The scoreboard changed. The thrill didn't disappear. It matured. Blind spots got names. Greed, ego, grievance. The human factors that don't show up on a clearance form until they do. Continuous evaluation tried to read those signals without turning the building into a panopticon. The doctrine drew a line. We watch behaviors that correlate with risk, not beliefs that correlate with difference. Financial stress spikes, that's signal. A messy divorce, context, not verdict. A sudden ideological rant in the office, add to the mosaic. Patterns, not gotchas. The price of ignorance is always paid by someone who didn't get a vote. That's what haunted the postmortems. An engineer in a Moscow lab who trusted a meeting plan crafted in Virginia. A bureaucrat inside a ministry who believed he could thread the needle between patriotism and conscience. When you miss a mole, they pay. So the doctrine of doubt linked directly to duty of care. Handle plans had to show not just how to collect, but how to survive compromise. Exfil options weren't nice-to-haves. They were signatures on a promise. What nobody likes to admit is that institutions love certainty because certainty sells. A clean line in a briefing room gets heads nodding and budgets approved. Doubt muddies lines. It asks leaders to tolerate ambiguity and invest in protections that don't produce headlines. The reformers learn to translate doubt for decision makers. Here, that's the confidence interval. Here's the mitigation. Here's the failure plan. No melodrama, just adult risk math. That language kept doors open when nerves frayed. The doctrine also redefined heroism. In the old myth, the hero makes the meat at any cost. In the new ledger, The hero cancels the meet when the pattern twitches. One case officer wrote in a performance review, aborted 2 operations for CI concerns, later validated by unrelated adversary activity. That line used to sound like an excuse. It started sounding like craft. A generation raised on chase stories learned to respect the quiet save. Now remember, democracy complicates this. Vigilance collides with liberty in a building built to protect both. That tension lives in people, risk officers, lawyers, operators, who carry competing obligations in the same spine. The insider threat architecture ran through oversight like a spine. Inspectors general, congressional committees, lawyers in the room. Guards against mission creep weren't window dressing. They were guardrails the culture agreed to stay inside. The doctrine of doubt would rot into paranoia without them. Angleton's ghost kept a seat at the table to remind everyone where overreach leads. What nobody knew at the time the doctrine took shape was how digital life would amplify both risk and detection. Data lakes made spotting anomalies easier and mass compromise catastrophic. Doubt adapted, log access, alert on weird minimized by default, but the human core stayed the same. A senior CI trainer told new officers, if a story makes you feel clever, it's probably wrong. Make it make sense to your laziest future self. That line walked halls like scripture. There was a cost internally, friction. Dissent climbed. Meetings lengthened because someone had to play prosecutor. Fatigue set in. The antidote became discipline, not swagger. Time-boxed red teams, clear thresholds, decision rights documented so no didn't become the only safe answer. Doubt as doctrine, yes. Not doubt as destiny. The point wasn't to freeze. It was to move with eyes open and contingencies packed. Setups and payoffs started showing up in training as living exercises. To understand betrayal, first see the friendship. New officers read sanitized case files where the recruiting officer liked the target too much to see the angle. Then they wrote the moment they would have walked away. They practiced saying no to their own best ideas. That muscle matters when a handler's pride wants to override a warning. Pride is the cheapest currency an adversary can spend you with. Meanwhile, leadership had to model the doctrine in public and private. Directors who admitted misses without euphemism bought credibility that memos never could. Deputies who killed pet projects for CI reasons taught thousands of eyes to read that as strength. The price of ignorance is paid twice if you pretend you didn't write the check. After Ames and Hanssen, pretense died. The survivors became storytellers with scars, not pitchmen with slogans. One more hard edge. Doubt demands reciprocity across agencies. CIA can't run doctrine in a vacuum while the Bureau runs optimism or vice versa. Joint centers institutionalized shared doubt. Same anomalies, same standards, same willingness to stop. That doesn't erase culture. It does align incentives. When both sides accept the inside threat as a feature, not a bug, the seam stops being a refuge for traitors. So back to that night when phones lit and voices vanished. The meaning lands here. Betrayal didn't just wreck operations, it rewired identity. The agency learned to see itself as both hunter and possible habitat for the hunted. It learned to brief uncertainty without losing authority. It learned to prize the colleague who says, prove it, and to teach the rookie that walking away can be a win. The doctrine of doubt isn't fear dressed up. It's respect. Respect for an adversary who studies you, for a partner who trusts you, and for the people who'll pay if you lie to yourself. Echoes in today's battles: China, Russia, and the new CI frontier. Adversaries took notes. They studied Ames and Hanssen like a manual, not a cautionary tale. The psychology of leverage, greed, grievance, ego became an operating system. Russia's services, FSB, SVR, GRU, absorbed the lesson that insiders beat fences, seams beat firewalls, and patience beats pride. China's MSS scaled the insight. Where Russia ran precision penetrations, Beijing ran volume and long game, weaving industrial, academic, and diaspora channels into a broad net. Both built doctrine around one idea: make American trust do the work. Start with Russia. The tradecraft stayed familiar, the wrappers changed. Illegals programs revived with better covers, deeper legends, digital hygiene that survived casual checks. They pushed cyber-enabled CI, spearfish and admin, map credentials, learn who accesses what, then spot the officer whose life doesn't match the ledger. They courted contractors and techs who never imagined they'd be targets. They probed joint seams, liaison services, multinational task forces, private sector partners, anywhere ownership blurs and accountability softens. The goal wasn't just to steal. It was to blind the other side just enough to buy freedom of action in grey zones from Donbass to Damascus. Meanwhile, China built a scale operation. 1,000 grains of sand intelligence. Gather pieces until the picture resolves. They ran talent programs and research exchanges with embedded collection goals. They targeted supply chains, cloud admins, and data lakes, places where a single compromised credential opens a mile of corridors. They leveraged family pressure and career aspiration as twin levers, and they understood the quiet power of metadata, who talks to whom when, for how long. You don't need every content line when patterns betray priorities. Digital life raised the stakes. Classified sprawl and remote work expanded attack surfaces. Logs became both shield and risk, catch anomalies faster, but store more to be stolen in a breach. Insider threat teams had to think like network defenders and interrogators at once. Continuous evaluation went real-time for critical roles. Financial spikes, travel anomalies, odd hours access, data pulls at volumes that screamed curiosity turned appetite. Alerts flowed into joint centers where CIA and FBI sat shoulder to shoulder, hunting needles before they lit fires. Here's where discipline met democracy. The more you watch, the more you risk watching the wrong things. Oversight tightened rules, monitor behavior correlated with risk, minimize personal content, audit the auditors. The doctrine of doubt survived because guardrails kept it from curdling into surveillance of conscience. In practice, that meant narrower targeting, faster deletion of non-relevant data, and external review with authority to call foul. The system had to stay sharp, without turning inward on the liberties it protects. Operationally, HUMINT adapted to a sensor-saturated world. SDRs incorporated digital silence windows and spoofed presence tactics. Your phone at home, your body elsewhere. Meetings keyed to chaotic events that cameras can't predict. Pop-up markets, transit breakdowns, weather shocks. Case officers learned device discipline like life support. Air-gap notes, compartmented comms, zero trust for convenience apps. Dead drops went low-tech paired with out-of-band verification. Two independent signals had to agree before anyone touched steel. Recruitment overseas demanded more empathy and more paranoia. In China lanes, officers structured approaches that protected families. Longer arcs, relocation pathways, financial footprints scrubbed of US fingerprints. In Russia lanes, paranoia ran hot. Sources who'd survived the 90s carried scars from purges and penetrations. The pitch had to promise not just meaning, but resilience. A plan for when, not if, something twitched. CI sat in the first conversation, not as a scold, but as proof of seriousness. Joint CI stood up as a standing posture, not a crisis surge. Quiet wins rarely see daylight. A compromised admin account caught at login. A dangle unraveled before the first coffee. A fake defector's tale mapped to a service's known deception lines, then fed back to waste their time. These don't headline. They stack into safety. The seam that used to be a wound turned into a sensor. When one side's dashboard blinked, the other side's phone rang without ego first. Russia's hybrid aggression kept stress-testing the system. Election cycles drew influence ops and cyber intrusions designed to sow doubt. CI's role wasn't to adjudicate politics. It was to map the foreign hand precisely, separate noise from tradecraft, and brief with receipts. That demanded restraint and speed in the same breath. The lesson from the 80s held, get the human right first. Attribution without overreach carries authority. Panic plays into an adversary's plan. China's tech reach pushed a different pressure. Data brokers knew more about American lives than clearance forms did. MSS could buy slices of insight and cross-reference them with stolen government files from breaches years old. The response turned architectural, minimized stored secrets, shard access, pushed decisions to the edge where no single credential could unlock an empire. Cultural change followed. Convenience got taxed. Need to share became need to proof share. Freedom and vigilance stayed in tension. Insider threat programs that worked published their values internally. Narrow collection, transparent policy, redress when wrong, punishment when willful. Training included rights briefings alongside tradecraft refreshers. The point wasn't cosmetic. Morale anchors security. If officers feel hunted by their own house, the best leave and the brittle stay. Doubt needed trust to stand on. Still, risk breathed. Adversaries iterate. A friendly face at a conference. A chat app fix after minor glitch. A liaison favor that bundles one extra document for context. The doctrine of doubt whispers. Prove the provenance, slow the hand, call the CI desk. It's not fear. It's craft in an era where betrayal can ride fiber or a handshake. Every decision at Moscow Station today carries that night's shadow, from asset validation to ally choice to who gets briefed. That's not paralysis. It's memory doing its job. The secret war never ends. In the end, the agency didn't just lose sources. It lost the illusion of certainty and rebuilt doubt into daily discipline. That's the quiet victory, designing a craft that expects betrayal and still moves. If you want the real story shaping military power, where clandestine battles collide with boots on the ground, subscribe now and watch our next investigation. We're tracing how modern spy games bend warfighting in real time, from cyber shadows to frontline decisions. New episodes drop weekly. Stay sharp, stay curious, and step into the war most people never see.